I know, it's not a corset, it's a pair of stays. I don't know if you necessarily have to care about the YouTube algorithm when you only have 33 subscribers, but I'm putting in the practice for a few years' time when I might have 100. Hello everyone. Sorry if the sound quality is crap, but my neighbour decided to trim his hedges as soon as I started filming. But never mind. I am here today after a very long process, and normally I would be filming the introduction before I make the thing that I'm making, but I got COVID and I wasn't even a hot mess. There was nothing about me that was hot, apart from my temperature. I was just a snotty, grimy, really disgusting mess, and I did not feel like being seen on camera. The pattern I use for the pair of stays is in Patterns of Fashion 5, which is an amazing book by Janet Arnold, produced by the School of Historical Dress in London. The one that I used for my pair of stays was this one right here. Now, in terms of matching this to my theme of it being an outfit for Rincewind, this is going to be in red, which is sort of the colours of the robes of Unseen University, but this is going to be in a nice bright red. I found a beautiful, so beautiful red linen that my mum very kindly got for me for Christmas, and I've used that for the outside of the stays. The makeup of the stays is that you have an outer layer, which is going to be in red linen, and then you have 2 layers of interlining, which are canvas. I've used a cotton canvas, but I think in the 18th century they might have used hemp or linen. Was linen canvas a thing? I probably should have researched that before now, but I had access to cotton canvas, so that's what I used. And then it also has a lining inside, which I've also used cotton for, but would definitely have been linen, or at least it was on the original garment. I think I've done enough yakking on, so let's get straight down to making it. These are the pattern pieces for one half of the stays. I've cut 4 of each of these out on the cotton canvas, as we've got 2 layers of that. As you can see, it's nice and densely woven. It's quite stiff, and this is going to be really good for keeping those bones in place and holding the shape. I realised I didn't actually say what stays are in the introduction. So basically, it's the precursor to a Victorian corset. They're a foundational garment worn on the outside of the shift, but typically under a gown, and they provide support and give you that classic conical 18th century silhouette. I've basted the 3 layers of fabric for each panel, so that's the linen on top, and then 2 layers of canvas underneath, in between which the bones are going to go. The dashed lines on the pattern piece represent the boning channels. Now, as you can see, these ones are quite narrow. 3/16 of an inch, in fact. Because of the boning I have, mine are going to be every other dashed line. And we're going to poke holes in every other boning line on the pattern piece. And then using a felt tip, draw through each hole onto the back of each panel. I've shaded every other one of my boning channels just to make it really clear to me what's going on, and as you can see, they are substantially wider than the original channels. And now we begin thread marking those channel lines. This is just the process of basting so that the thread goes through all 3 layers and can be seen from the front. And this is going to enable me to know where to stitch the boning channels on. And now it's time to stitch those channel lines on for real. Unfortunately, my mum's sewing machine does this weird thing where a straight line of stitching is not a straight line, but I'm in isolation here, so gotta make do. And now we completely undo all of the hours spent thread marking, but it was definitely worth it to get these lines absolutely perfect. This is Buzz. Sadly, I don't get to see him very often, so it's important to take frequent cat appreciation breaks. And now it's time to sew these panels together into something that looks vaguely like a pair of stays. We're going to do this along all of the seams, and as you can see, these seams are going to need a hefty amount of pressing. Okay, so we've now sewn all of the channels, all of the boning channels, we've sewn all of the pieces together. This is what it looks like on the front. This on the back. So we've got these flappy bits of seam allowance here. And altogether, I don't think it's looking too bad. It's definitely taking shape. So I thought the best way to explain what we're going to do is to do it on the other half. As you can see, this is all looking finished. The first thing I did was binding the bottom here, because once the bottom is bound, then we can put the bones in. And this has just been done with some bias binding tape, some pre-made stuff that I got online. It's a slightly darker red bias binding. I would have liked it to be even darker, but you know, we've got to work with what we got. These bits here, the curved bits of binding around the skirt were absolutely horrendous. I mean, you can see on the other side where I was just so tired, where I've just let that pleat. It just upset me so much, and I was doing it when I was hungover as well, so that wasn't a good idea. Yeah, I did not particularly enjoy doing the binding. It's 1:30 in the morning. I'm having a realisation that 2 months is, in fact, probably not enough time to make an entire historically inspired 18th century outfit from the undergarments out, and film and edit the whole process. Honestly, this bias binding is going to kill me. I don't think it is possible to accurately describe just how much of my soul is going into this pair of stays, but I know that I am going to be thoroughly pleased when they're done. I'm gonna go to bed and hope that the mice come in the night and finish my bias binding. Night night. So after that I put the bones in. As you can see here, it's a bit more solid. So I also did the binding along the side here so that I could then do some hand stitch eyelets. The thread I've used is basically the exact same colour as the red linen, so you can't see that in super detail. But I've done that on the centre front closure and the centre back, and I just followed the placement of the eyelets on the pattern. So then after I'd done those eyelet holes, what I did then was felling down these seams. Now, because this is going to be covered by lining and you won't see this, I haven't bothered to fold under the edges. I've just overcast them, which is where you sort of fell it over the raw edge. It's not just a time-saving thing, it's also going to help to reduce the bulk down, because obviously if I had all of these folded, you'd get a bit more bulk around these seams. So for comparison, this is flappy and adding quite a bit of thickness, whereas this is nice and thin and all in place. Then the final thing that I have just finished doing is binding the top so that all of these bones stay inside. So now that half is finished, apart from obviously the lining and this bit here, which is where the strap will go. However, I might leave it strapless, but we'll see. So that's what we're aiming for. That's what we got. Let's go. So first we start off with that bias binding. Hooray! At least we're doing a straight line here. And we're going to fell this down very carefully with tiny stitches so it looks nice and neat. When we get to those top corners of the skirts, we're still felling, but we're sort of turning the binding as we go. Here I've put the thread on the inside of the binding and we're just sort of squooshing the binding round so that we don't get too many wrinkles or pleats, and I'm using a small back stitch to fix that down. Right, so I've done the binding on the bottom of the second half, which is good because that, as you probably gathered from the first half, is my least favourite bit. Now I've bound the front edge, but we have a slight problem. When I was trimming the edge of the back half, I accidentally trimmed off too much of the red. If we take a look at the finished half, this is the back edge. Now what I did here, there's a little seam that goes down there, and that is basically just where I attached another strip of fabric to this and then folded it round so that this would look like it was just bound with the red linen and that just goes over the edge. Now I can still do that with this one, but it's gonna be more difficult to hide that seam because this is not big enough to fold around to the edge while still being able to get a bone in there. The bones that I have, if I can just grab one from another channel, are 6mm. So this is a little over 6mm, so we might be able to get away with the seam just appearing on the side rather than on the front, which would be ideal, but we'll see how we go. This is going to be on the back anyway, so it's not the end of the world if it doesn't look insanely neat. So this isn't going to be quite as neat as the other one, but you know, piecing is period. I'm using some cotton that I salvaged from a previous mock-up to do the lining. In the original garment, the lining wasn't cut out in the same way that the other layers of the stays were. It was sort of pieced together on top of it. So I've tried to do this as accurately as I can, just sort of tracing over the cotton. Now the final step is aglets. These are the bits that go on the end of the laces. So we're going to chop the end off of that so it's nice and neat. And then it's pretty simple. You just fold the lace down, pop it in the aglet, and I don't have one of those special aglet setting tools, so I'm just using some pliers. And I'm sort of going around and alternating which direction I'm squeezing in so that we can get, hopefully, a nice rounded shape. And with that, we are pretty much done. I know it looks unprofessional to have my phone in my pocket, but I was frolicking in the woods in Southampton of all places, so, you know, safety first. So, there you go. That was the very long and very labour-intensive process of making a pair of 18th century stays. Ish. You always got to add the caveat of ish because of the materials and the width of the boning channels and all of that stuff. And the use of an electric sewing machine. Didn't have that in the 18th century. So, I'm so happy. I had this moment a couple of days ago, just before I finished. I had like the tiniest bit left to do, and you know how they say that when you're about to freeze to death you have this moment of euphoria? I felt like that, except I was about to do like the final bit of felling and I just felt absolutely euphoric. It was such a long process, but I'm really pleased with the result. I just love that it looks like an actual pair of stays. It's very exciting. Up to this point I've only made a skirt, I've made a couple of dresses, I've knitted stuff, but I know I can never I always lose the will to live before I can make something as big as a jumper, so I've only ever made like gloves and occasionally socks and very little things like that. So it's really kind of incredible to have something that is more complicated and is something that I've seen online and in books and museums, but I never thought that I'd actually be able to make it because it always looked a bit too complex. But actually, obviously there's a lot of work that goes into it, but none of it was that complicated. I think the most technical fiddly bit was probably doing the bias binding on the little curvy bits. And I tell you what, I am gonna think really hard if I find myself going to make another garment that has bias binding on really tight round edges, because honestly that nearly killed me. That combined with COVID nearly took me away. So yeah, in terms of what I like about it, I really like the finish. I think it looks proper, you know, it looks like an actual garment, and I think it looks quite neat. I'm also really pleased with how the aglets look on the end of the laces. I mean, this is another thing where like, that's a lace, that's what they look like when they've got a metal aglet on the end, and it's just kind of cool to be able to have done it yourself. But that's a very small thing. So yeah, in general I'm very happy with the quality and the colour. I love the colour, and actually, even though I wanted a darker bias binding, I'm actually really happy with how it turned out. I think what I would probably improve if I were to do it next time, so two things really, and that's the lining and the eyelet holes. So some of these eyelet holes, the way I did it was I widened it with a knitting needle, as you saw. So I put the awl in and then widened it with a knitting needle, and I kind of wish I hadn't done that, because in some cases you can see the canvas underneath, it's sort of ripped through the top of the linen, which I'm not too happy about, and I think if I'd kept it smaller it would have been fine, because my reasoning was that the laces are quite thick, so the hole would need to be this thick, but of course the laces are squishy and the aglets weren't that thick. So I think if I bought the aglets earlier, I could have tested whether it would have gone through the original hole and I wouldn't have had to like widen it so much. And apart from anything else, this would have made the process a lot quicker. So in terms of the lining, there are some bits that I have kind of fudged, and the insides of these little skirts here of the curve, they do sometimes miss the mark, and also I've ended up overcasting some of these edges rather than being able to fold it over and fell it, because I just didn't have enough fabric to fold it over. But that was down to me when I was cutting out the lining being so done. I mean, this whole process took me 18 or 19 solid days work. 10 days of which I was in isolation, and I was with my mum and my stepdad, but not being allowed to leave the house is difficult, and you don't realise how much you miss it until you can't do it. So yeah, I think at that point I was just like, I just need to get it done. I just want this to be finished, and that will do. That'll do, pig. So I think that about wraps it up. The next stage is to do the hat and the cloak, and it's going to be a cloak rather than robes, and I will explain that when we get to that video. And I'm going to make the skirt, the petticoat, off screen, because I don't think I'm going to have enough time to film it all and edit it and everything. Thank you for joining me throughout this process. If you would like to follow me on Instagram, I will put that info in the description. If you would like to see me continue and hopefully finish this process and create an 18th century rincewind look, then please consider subscribing and liking this video and all of that nonsense. Thanks very much, guys. Bye!